Most people who find this video have been paying genuine attention for a long time. Not necessarily through any sort of formal practice, although many have. It's through reading, through doing inner work in whatever form it took, through living long enough and honestly enough to know that something fundamental has not yet resolved. The understanding may be real. The glimpses may have been genuine. And yet the baseline of daily life, how the system actually runs under pressure and in relationships, in ordinary moments, continues as it always has. And so this video is about that baseline, about understanding where the human system is actually organized and why it tends to stay there regardless of what has been touched above it. I want to show you a simple scale. This scale represents the activation state of the human system, not just one layer, the whole system, the body, the energetic system, field, consciousness, all of it together. And at the top, 10 is complete overload, the system beyond its capacity to function. And at the bottom, 0 to 1, maybe 2, is the state the system was actually designed to live from. Deep ease, full restoration, and life moving through the system without accumulating as weight. And most people assume they live somewhere in the middle, and they're probably right. But where exactly in the middle is what matters. Because there's a significant difference between a 4 and a 2 that a lot of approaches never address. So if we look at 10, it would be what we call a system overload. The body is in extreme response. The breathing is fast and shallow. The musculature has contracted hard. Sleep is affected if it comes at all, and it brings no restoration. The system has gone beyond its capacity to process what is arriving. And the energetic system and the field around us and beyond us are fragmented. There is no coherence, no communication, no real flow. It's just disruption. And most people recognize this state. Most people also believe they don't live here. And for the most part, that is true. But what is worth noticing is how little distance there can be between 8 and 10 when the right pressure arrives. So when we look at 8 and 9 on the scale, the body is responding as though something is happening right now, even when it isn't. And the heart rate elevates, the muscles contract, the breathing has moved really high into the chest, and the whole system has activated its threat response. It's scanning, it's testing, it's bracing, it's preparing. And the energetic system, it surges or compresses in on itself, and the field then contracts very sharply. And what is important here is that this state doesn't require an actual threat to activate. A memory may be enough, a tone of voice, a familiar dynamic in a relationship. The system has learned what threat feels like, and it responds to the pattern, not just the event. And so for someone with a genuine practice, the return from here may be faster than it once was. And the tools are real. The capacity to work with what has arisen is genuine. But the fact that the system still moves to an 8, still activates fully when the right conditions arrive, tells you something precise about where the baseline actually lives. The practice manages the return. It has not yet changed the ground the system returns to. And so if we look at 6 and 7 on the scale, this is where sustained pressure then lives. The body carries increased tension throughout the body, maybe the jaws, the shoulder, the gut, behind the eyes. The breathing is consistently shallow. The system is partially activated all the time throughout the day. It's managing, it's handling, but it's getting through. And the energetic system is working really hard. It's processing and managing internal pressure rather than moving freely. And then the field is contracted and reactive. And so other people's states then register more intensely, and environments feel louder and more demanding. And many people visit this level regularly. Different periods, high pressure season, times of relational strain. The assumption is that when the pressure lifts, the system returns to its natural baseline. And here is where something important starts to become visible. Around 4 to 5, the body carries chronic background tension, not intense, and it's not dramatic, it's just present. The system remains still partially activated throughout the day. It's alert even when nothing particular is happening. And then the mind stays active. The thoughts continue when there is nothing urgent to think about. The system scans, reviews, anticipates quietly and habitually without being asked to. And the energetic system is constantly processing internal pressure. There is movement, but it is working movement. It's managing what has accumulated rather than flowing freely. And in this state, the field is less coherent. It's more reactive to external input, and other people's energy registers more than it would be in a settled system. And the experience of all of this, the lived texture of operating here, is that life feels manageable. Responsibilities get met, things get handled. From the outside, everything looks functional. But there is a constant low-level effort running beneath all of it. There's a background hum of managing and bracing and preparing and recovering. And most people who live here have lived here long enough that this is simply what life feels like. This is not the baseline the system was designed for. It is the baseline the system has learnt. And that distinction is everything. And so if we go to the 3 on the scale, and so the body at this level has released, the system has settled, there is genuine quiet. And this is the state that serious practice, deep meditation and retreats and real work with a teacher can produce. And it is real. The opening is not imagined. Something actual has been touched. But notice how it was reached. Often it's through practice, through sustained sitting, concentrated presence, hours of working through restlessness until something shifted and settled. And the system was held there or moved there through the effort and structure of the practice itself. And so what happens when the practice ends? For most people who have done genuine work, The answer is already known. The system returns, maybe not dramatically, but quietly. And the baseline reasserts itself, and life resumes at 4, and sometimes at 5. And the practice has to be re-entered to return to what was touched. The opening was real, but the ground beneath it has not really changed. And that, for someone who has engaged sincerely with their inner life for years, is a very specific and quietly exhausting recognition. And if we go down to 0 to 1 or 2, what happens there? This is the state the system was designed for. And in this state, breathing is deep and slow and low in the body. The musculature is soft without collapse. The system repairs, it integrates, it renews. And so the system rests in its natural state. It can respond when needed, and it returns to ease without so much effort and without so much recovery time. Thought happens when something needs to be thought about. Silence is actually silent. And the energetic system moves freely. There's no sense of pushing or managing or holding or contracting. Energy is available without pressure. And then the field is open and it's coherent and it's stable. And the experience, the lived texture of operating here, is that life moves through the system and events arrive and they're met and they complete. And the residue from that does not accumulate. The system returns to ease, not because it's working at returning, but because ease is where it rests. And this is not a state the system visits. It is a baseline the system lives from. There is one thing worth being very clear about here. A system resting at 0 to 1 or fluctuating between 1 and 2 is not a system that has stopped responding to life. It is not flat or withdrawn or unreachable by intensity. When a genuine threat arrives, a real emergency, something that actually requires full activation, the system can respond completely. It goes where it needs to go. It can go to an 8, 9 if the situation calls for it. The response is appropriate and immediate. The difference is what happens when the event is over. The system returns. And it's not through constant effort or recovery time or days of processing what happens. It returns because ease is where it is organized. The event completes and the system completes with it. And for someone whose system has genuinely reorganized at this level, even a sudden push to a 6, an unexpected difficulty, a sharp moment of pressure, has a different quality. The drop back does not become recovery, it is completion. And so the event moved through rather than lodging. And so nothing becomes accumulated, nothing required days and days of processing from that higher state of being. And so compare that to a system running at a 4 to 5, where a difficult conversation from 3 days ago is still being carried in the body, where an interaction that lasts 20 minutes is still running as tension a week later. At 0 to 1 or 2, life moves through the system. At 4 to 5, life accumulates in it. That is the structural difference. And so here we need to talk about why the system stays where it actually is. And the human system is a really complex, adaptive system. And these sorts of systems have a particular quality. They organize around their own patterns. They learn what their environment requires of them. And what they learn, they maintain. And so a system that has been running at 4 to 5 for years doesn't stay there by accident. It stays there because it has organized itself around that level. And so the tension patterns in the body have become structural. The energetic system has learned to manage at that level rather than flowing freely. And the field has settled into a configuration it returns to very, very reliably. And so the whole system has built itself around its own baseline. And it maintains that baseline because that is what it knows. And so this then becomes a closed loop. The bracing produces the experience of a world that requires bracing, which then confirms to the system that bracing is appropriate, which then maintains the bracing. And here is the important part. The system filters incoming experience through its own structure. So new information arrives and gets processed through the existing framework, the structure, the architecture. And new experiences arrive and get metabolized by the same system that produced the current baseline. Even genuine insight arrives at the level of understanding, and understanding sits above the level where the structure actually lives. And so the loop continues because nothing has yet reached the layer where the loop is running. And so there are 3 patterns worth naming here specifically, because they are very common among people who have done serious work, and all 3 produce a version of the same outcome. And the first is activation-based practice. And it may be very intense and very cathartic, and it's practices that maybe involve shaking or strong physical or emotional activation. Anything that deliberately pushes the system into a heightened state in order to produce an opening. And the opening can be genuine. When the system is pushed that far up the scale, something does open, it does release. The intensity creates a kind of forced discharge. And in the moments after, the system drops. Sometimes all the way to a 3, but very rarely lower. And so the person experiences something real. There's a profound shift, a depth they recognize as what they have been looking for. But watch what happens next. The system has not learned to rest at 3. It has never built the architecture for ease at that level. It only arrived there because it was pushed through intensity. And so, without the intensity holding it there, it returns back to where it was organized before, and the baseline remains unchanged. And over time, something else happens. The system begins to associate depth with activation. It learns that the pathway to opening runs through intensity, and gradually it begins to need higher and higher activation to produce the same opening, because the system adapts to repeated inputs. Now, this is not a failure of the person or the practice. It is the behavior of an adaptive system responding to the pattern it has been given. And so the system has learned that it needs a heightened state to create a state. That is a different kind of loop. And then the baseline has still never moved. And the second pattern is sustained stillness practice. So you can have hours of sitting, deep meditation practices that hold the system in a quiet state through sustained concentration and effort. The person arrives at 2 or 3. There's genuine quiet, something real is touched. But watch how it was produced. The quiet is held there by the effort of the practice, the concentration, the sustained sitting, the working through the restlessness until something settles. The system has been moved into quiet. And so when the practice ends, when ordinary life resumes, the holding a lot of the time ends with it. The system returns because the quiet was a state the system was maintained in. And so the baseline hasn't necessarily changed. The system still didn't know how to rest at 2 without the effort of practice producing it. And so the person who has sat for thousands of hours and still finds that daily life runs at 4 or 5 or maybe dips down to a 3 in conversations under pressure in ordinary moments is experiencing exactly this. The practice is genuine and the openings were absolutely real, but the baseline is unchanged because the baseline lives at a layer the practice hasn't yet reached. And then the third pattern is quieter than the others and often harder to recognize because from the outside and often from the inside, it looks like it has worked. The person has simplified. They have withdrawn from relationships that created activation. They've chosen environments that feel manageable. They've structured their days around what the system can handle. And within that structure, there is genuine quiet. And life feels far more peaceful. But watch what happens when the structure is disrupted. There's an unexpected conflict, a demanding situation that cannot be avoided. The system doesn't stay at 2 or 3. It moves sometimes really quickly and really sharply to 6, 7, 8. Because the baseline was never 2. The system was resting inside a carefully maintained container. And so if you remove the container, the system shows exactly where it is actually organized. Controlled quiet is not the same as genuine ease. Genuine ease doesn't require the environment to cooperate. It meets intensity from a settled place. And it's not because the intensity has been kept out, but it's because the system generating the response to intensity has reorganized. And so a life that is arranged around avoiding activation is still a life organized around activation. The activation is just being managed at a distance rather than met directly. And again, the baseline has still never moved. And what do all these 3 patterns have in common? All 3 produce the same outcome. The activation practitioner needs the session to touch depth, and the stillness practitioner needs the cushion and the hours. And the person with the carefully managed life needs the structure to stay intact. None of them has built the framework for depth to be present in ordinary life, in a conversation, under pressure, in the middle of a working day. So if you remove the practice, the session, or the controlled environment, and the system runs where it always has. And this is the recognition most people who have done genuine work eventually arrive at. And this is a very specific recognition. And like I said, it's not a failure of commitment or of the work, but it is an encounter with the structural ceiling of what approaches can often reach. The ceiling is real, and it is worth understanding precisely where it is. So what moves the baseline is different from what produces a state. It is work that reaches the layer where the structure actually lives. And so the body releasing what it was never designed to hold permanently, or the energetic system learning a genuinely different resting point, and the field learning to move freely without being pushed or held or controlled. This happens gradually. It cannot be pushed into opening by intensity. It cannot be held in quiet by effort or control or demand, but genuinely learning a different way of being. And when that happens, something changes that doesn't require constant maintenance and holding. The depth that was briefly touched through activation or sustained sitting begins to become the ground. And ordinary life, even the pressures of ordinary life, in conversation, in work, in relationships, starts to be met from a very different place, because the system generating the experience of those things has changed and the baseline has moved. And what changes at that level stays changed over time. That is the question worth sitting with. What would it take for the system to live from ease? Not as something achieved, but as where it rests.